The room wasn't silent, far from it. Cameras clicked, producers whispered through headsets, and the studio lights buzzed with electricity. But Jordan Peterson heard none of it. He sat calmly at the edge of the faux wood table, fingers steepled, eyes fixed on the young journalist across from him. She looked no older than 28, sharp in her tailored blazer, her lips curled with a polite but unmistakable smirk. "This is a safe space for truth, Dr. Peterson," she said, adjusting her mic. "You've always advocated for free speech, so I'm sure you'll be comfortable with a few challenging questions." Peterson offered no reply, only that cool nod of acknowledgement he gave when deciding whether to respond or to let silence do the heavy lifting. The countdown began. 5, 4, 3. "We're live in 3, 2. Her smile grew. "Welcome back to Unfiltered, where we pull no punches and expose the raw, unscripted realities behind public personas. Our guest today is psychologist and author Jordan Peterson, controversial figure, free speech advocate, and, according to some, an outdated voice for a world trying to move forward." There it was, the opening jab. Peterson didn't flinch. The interviewer, whose name tag read Nina Graves, leaned forward. "Dr. Peterson, let's start with something simple. You've argued that the gender pay gap is not primarily due to discrimination, but to different choices men and women make. Many say that's a dangerous narrative. Do you stand by that?" The way she asked it wasn't curiosity, it was setup. Her tone was gleaming with the assurance of someone who believed she held the intellectual high ground. A live studio audience watched quietly, unsure if they should laugh or lean in. Peterson paused just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Then, with quiet precision, he spoke. "I don't offer narratives, Ms. Graves, I offer data. If facts make people uncomfortable, that's not an argument against the facts, it's a sign the conversation is overdue." There was a moment, so brief you could miss it, where Nina's expression twitched, but she recovered quickly. "So, just to be clear," she pressed, "you believe it's okay to blame women for systemic inequalities?" "No," he said flatly. "And if that's what you've extracted from my work, you haven't read it carefully or at all." The temperature in the studio shifted. The crew, once bustling, now stood still. Nina blinked, clearly trying to stay in control of the narrative. Peterson didn't gloat, he just waited. Then she smiled again, wider this time, theatrical. "Let's talk about personal responsibility then. You've become a sort of father figure to many young men. Doesn't that worry you? That maybe your message is being weaponized?" Jordan leaned in, voice softer. "What worries me is that so many young men are desperate for someone to tell them they matter, and rather than ask why, journalists like you mock them, and anyone who speaks to their pain." Silence. Real silence. And in that stillness, the live audience didn't laugh. They didn't clap. They just stared. Si esta historia ya te tocó el corazón, suscríbete al canal y cuéntanos en los comentarios. ¿Qué crees que está pasando realmente? Ahora, continuemos. After the cameras cut to a commercial, Nina's smile vanished. She didn't look at Jordan, didn't speak, just sipped her water and stared at the blank teleprompter like it had betrayed her. The producers rushed around them, tweaking lights, whispering into headsets, pretending the tension wasn't thick enough to chew. Peterson didn't move. He just sat there unbothered, his hands resting calmly on the table. He'd done this before, many times. But something about this felt different. Not more hostile, just more orchestrated. Across the studio, Nina's assistant approached her quietly and handed her a phone. She read something quickly, nodded once, and set it aside. Then she glanced at Peterson, not angry, not shaken, studying him. "You do realize," she said quietly, "that most people watching think you're dangerous." "I know," Peterson replied, unfazed, "but only the ones who've never listened to a full sentence I've said." The commercial break ended. The red light blinked on. "We're back with Dr. Jordan Peterson," Nina said, voice smoother now, more controlled. "Earlier we touched on the idea of masculinity in crisis. Let's dig deeper. You've written that modern culture pathologizes masculinity. What do you mean by that?" Jordan straightened. "Young men are told they're toxic for existing. They're discouraged from ambition, competitiveness, strength, Traits that, when integrated properly, build stable families and societies. We pretend these traits are dangerous. That's a lie. And what about vulnerability? Empathy, Nina challenged. Aren't those masculine traits too? Of course they are, Peterson said, but they don't negate the rest. Telling a man he can only be soft isn't liberation. It's neutering. The audience was quiet again. This wasn't outrage. It was confusion. Nina glanced at them, then back at Peterson. Do you think, she said more slowly now, that maybe you're just nostalgic for a version of the world that no longer exists? Jordan looked at her differently this time, not combative, curious. Do you really think young people feel liberated right now? That they're thriving in this new world? Depression, addiction, loneliness, all rising. You call it progress. I call it pain. Nina faltered. For the first time, she had no follow-up. Peterson continued, voice low. When a culture shames its men, ridicules fathers, mocks responsibility, we don't get freedom, we get chaos. That's not nostalgia. That's a warning. She opened her mouth, closed it. From behind the glass, a producer gestured. Wrap it up. Nina glanced at the clock. One segment left. She inhaled, squared her shoulders, and forced the smile back onto her face. Well, after the break, Dr. Peterson will take a few questions from our live audience, and let's see if the next generation has something to say about all this. The screen faded to black. Off camera, Jordan looked at her. This isn't a game to me. Nina didn't answer. But the smallest flicker in her eye said, maybe it wasn't to her either. Si esta historia ya te tocó el corazón, suscríbete al canal y cuéntanos en los comentarios. ¿Qué crees que está pasando realmente? Ahora continuemos. The studio lights dimmed slightly as the audience segment began. A handheld mic made its way down the aisle to a young man in a wrinkled hoodie, early 20s maybe. Nervous but determined, he stood up, cleared his throat, and spoke into the mic. Dr. Peterson, I just wanted to say thank you. I was lost last year. Like, really lost. And your lectures helped me get out of bed again. A few people in the audience shifted in their seats, uncomfortable with the rawness. Peterson nodded once, just enough to acknowledge the weight of the words. The young man hesitated, then added, but my question is, why do you think people hate that? Why is it wrong to say men need help too? The camera panned from the kid's flushed face to Peterson's calm expression. That's a good question, Peterson said, and the answer isn't simple. Some people carry resentment toward the past, toward men who abused power, ignored pain, caused harm. And that pain is real. But blaming all men for that? Silencing the ones who are already broken? That's not justice, that's vengeance. The young man sat down, and silence returned. Nina cleared her throat. Let's take another question. A woman in her mid-30s stood up next. Confident posture, clear voice. I'm a mother, she said, and I've got a teenage son. I've seen what you're talking about. The confusion, the anger, the guilt he feels for just being male. I don't agree with everything you say, but I do think he needs better role models. Peterson nodded, but she wasn't finished. My concern is this. Some of your fans use your words to justify hatred, misogyny, bigotry. Don't you have a responsibility to call that out more clearly? The air thickened again. It was the question waiting behind every polite exchange. Yes, Jordan said simply. I do, he paused, and I have. Many times. But the media doesn't quote those parts. They amplify the worst interpretations. That's not my fault, but it is my burden. He turned to face her more directly. If someone takes what I say and twists it into cruelty, that's a failure, of mine, of theirs, and of the culture that taught them how to hate. But I won't stay silent just because someone might misinterpret truth. Nina looked surprised, maybe even impressed. The woman nodded and sat down. The final question came from the back row, a young woman with a tight jaw and tired eyes. You talk about responsibility, she said. But what do you say to women who've had to carry it alone? Who raise boys without fathers? Who are the fathers too? Jordan's eyes softened. No defense, no counter. I say, You're doing the hardest job in the world, and I hope no one ever makes you feel small for it." She blinked, caught off guard. The applause that followed wasn't wild. It was slow, hesitant, and then real. Si esta historia ya te tocó el corazón, suscríbete al canal y cuéntanos en los comentarios. ¿Qué crees que está pasando realmente? Ahora continuemos. The segment ended, the credits rolled, and the studio lights slowly faded to their standby hue. The audience began filing out, murmuring among themselves, not in outrage or celebration, but in contemplation. Nina stayed seated, her hands still folded neatly on the table. For a moment, she looked like someone who didn't know if she had just won or lost something. Jordan stood and reached for his jacket. "Well," he said quietly, "that wasn't as combative as I expected." Nina looked up. "I didn't expect to feel conflicted." He paused, studying her. "I assume you came in with a plan," he said. She nodded. "We always do, but plans don't always survive contact with real answers." There was no sarcasm in her voice now, no performance. Jordan slung his jacket over one shoulder. "You were fairer than most." "That wasn't the goal," she admitted, "but maybe it should have been." The producer waved Nina over from across the room, but she raised a hand, asking for a minute. Jordan hesitated, then stepped closer to the table again. "May I ask you something?" She raised an eyebrow. "Do you believe I'm dangerous?" Nina held his gaze. "I believe your words are sharp enough that people bleed from misunderstanding them." He considered that. "And what do you hear in them?" She sighed, tapping a pen lightly against her palm. "Sometimes, a man trying to hold back a tide no one else can explain. Other times, a man fighting shadows from the past. But tonight," she hesitated. "Tonight I heard something else." Jordan waited. "I heard grief," she said. "Grief for what's being lost, for what's being forgotten." He didn't respond, not right away. Just nodded once, deeply, like it had cost something to do so. As he turned to leave, she stopped him. "One last thing," she said. "That last answer to the single mother, it wasn't in any of your books. It wasn't theory. It was human." Jordan gave a faint smile. "That's the part no one ever quotes." He walked away, leaving Nina at the table alone with her thoughts. The set was nearly empty now, and the energy had shifted. There was no celebration in the control room, no self-congratulations among the staff, just silence and the unmistakable tension of people wrestling with something they didn't quite have words for. In the hallway outside, Jordan passed by a janitor mopping the floor. The man looked up, then gave a small nod, not as a fan, but as a kind of quiet acknowledgement. Jordan returned it. No words exchanged. Back inside, Nina finally stood. She picked up her phone, opened Twitter, and stared at the draft she'd written earlier. "Peterson interview, toxic, outdated, and dangerously manipulative." She didn't post it. Instead, she deleted it. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't know what to say. Si esta historia ya te tocó el corazón, suscríbete al canal y cuéntanos en los comentarios. ¿Qué crees que está pasando realmente? Ahora, continuemos. 3 days passed. The clip from Unfiltered went viral within hours of airing. Not because of a shouting match or a dramatic walkout, there wasn't one, but because people couldn't stop talking about the silence. That moment when Peterson answered the final question, and no one knew what to say next. It spread across social media like wildfire. Peterson leaves audience in stunned silence. The comments were divided, of course. Some called it brilliant, others manipulative. But what surprised Nina was how many people weren't debating, they were listening, rewatching, reflecting. She hadn't expected that. She sat at her desk, the Manhattan skyline framed behind her, and stared at her inbox where a message had been sitting unread since the night of the interview. From Jordan.Peterson. Subject, appreciation, and a question. Nina, thanks for the conversation. I've done 100 interviews, but very few where I felt my words were truly heard, even if not agreed with. That matters more than you know. May I ask, did anything change for you that night? Jay, She hadn't answered right away. She didn't know how to. Now, she hovered her fingers over the keys, finally typing. Jordan, you asked me if anything changed. I think the honest answer is yes, but not in the way I expected. I started this job because I wanted to ask hard questions. Somewhere along the way, I started asking only the ones that get applause. I didn't realize that until you didn't give me the answers I'd scripted in my head. There was a moment, when you answered that mother in the audience, that I stopped performing. I wasn't sure what I felt, but it was real. That's rare in this business. So yes, something changed. Maybe not my beliefs, but definitely my posture. Nina, she hit send. Seconds later, before she could second guess it, the message was gone. Outside, New York moved as it always did, fast, unapologetic. But inside, something was slowing down, shifting. Her phone buzzed, a new email. From Jordan.Peterson. Subject, appreciation and a question. That's all I ever hoped for, that we'd stop shouting long enough to hear the questions beneath the noise. If you ever want to continue the conversation, off camera, no scripts, I'm open to it. Thank you for listening even when you didn't agree. J. She set the phone down and sat back in her chair. Somewhere far below, car horns echoed off concrete and glass, but she barely heard them. For the first time in a long while, she felt like a journalist again. Not a performer, not a provocateur, a seeker. She didn't know what the next story would be. But maybe, just maybe, she was finally ready to ask questions she didn't already know the answers to. Si esta historia ya te tocó el corazón, suscríbete al canal y cuéntanos en los comentarios. ¿Qué crees que está pasando realmente? Ahora, continuemos. It was Sunday evening when Nina finally brought it up. To the only people whose opinions she hadn't been seeking, but whose judgment mattered most. Her parents. They still lived in the same modest house in Queens, where every dinner came with stories, debates, and the occasional too-loud argument about politics or rent or how long to boil the pasta. Her father, a retired electrician with calloused hands and sharp opinions. Her mother, a public school teacher turned grandmother, whose warmth could disarm a bomb. They sat at the small round kitchen table, half-eaten bowls of rigatoni between them. The TV was on in the background, muted. Peterson's face flashed briefly on screen as a news anchor referenced the interview. Nina noticed. So did her dad. "Didn't you interview that guy?" he asked, chewing. "I did," she said, trying to sound casual. Her mom looked up. "Is he really as awful as they say?" Nina hesitated. She always thought this would be an easy answer, but now it wasn't. "No," she said finally. "He's not." Her father raised an eyebrow. "You used to call him dangerous." "I know," Nina replied, "and I still think some people twist what he says. But he's not the monster I expected. He's complicated." That got her mother's attention. "Complicated how?" "He says things that make people uncomfortable, about men, women, responsibility, meaning, but he doesn't say them with hate. He says them because I think he believes people are falling apart and no one's telling them the truth." Her parents exchanged a glance. Then her father leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Sounds like someone finally rattled your cage," he said, half smiling. "I'm just trying to be fair," Nina replied, bracing for the pushback, but her mom only nodded. Fairness isn't popular right now, but it matters. That stunned her more than any debate could have. They finished dinner quietly after that, the kind of quiet that follows a conversation where something real has shifted. Nina helped clear the plates, but her mind was still spinning. Later that night, alone in her apartment, she opened her laptop and started writing. Not a segment, not a script, but a personal essay. She titled it, "When Listening Feels Like Losing." In it, she admitted something no one expected her to, that she'd gone into the interview prepared to win, to dismantle, to reduce. But instead, she'd been forced to slow down, reconsider, and actually listen. It wasn't a retraction, it wasn't a fan letter. It was something rarer. It was honest. She didn't know if she'd publish it yet, but even writing it felt like a kind of freedom. Like maybe truth didn't belong to one side of a debate, but somewhere in the space neither side wanted to stand in for too long. Somewhere quieter. Somewhere harder. Si esta historia ya te tocó el corazón, suscríbete al canal y cuéntanos en los comentarios. ¿Qué crees que está pasando realmente? Ahora, continuemos. A week later, Nina found herself standing at the edge of an auditorium at NYU. It wasn't planned. She hadn't RSVP'd. She hadn't even told her team. She was there because Jordan Peterson was giving a lecture. Not a debate, not a media event. Just a lecture, something she used to scoff at. But now curiosity pulled stronger than cynicism. She stayed near the back, behind rows of undergrads scribbling in notebooks, nodding along, some sitting cross-legged on the floor. The room was packed but still hushed, as if everyone instinctively understood that whatever was happening deserved their full attention. Jordan stood at the podium, no script, no teleprompter. His voice steady, his message familiar. "Meaning is what saves people from despair," he said. "Responsibility gives life depth, and we are starving for both." Nina felt it differently now. Not because the words were new, they weren't, but because she no longer filtered them through the need to disprove them. She just listened. After the lecture, she waited. Watched him shake hands, pose for photos, accept folded notes from students. She didn't plan to approach, but he noticed her anyway. "Nina," he said, stepping down from the stage, genuinely surprised. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I didn't expect to be here," she admitted, "but I'm glad I came." He studied her face. "Something's changed. I'm not sure what it is yet," she said, "but I'm learning how to sit with discomfort instead of filling it with noise." Jordan smiled, an actual smile, small and tired but sincere. "I read your essay," he said. "It was generous, especially because it didn't pretend to agree with everything. That takes courage." She nodded. "I wasn't trying to be generous. I was trying to be fair. That's harder." They stood in silence for a moment as students filtered out around them, some still glancing at the unexpected scene, the interviewer and the interviewee, side by side, no cameras rolling. Finally, Nina spoke. "I still think some of your ideas land harsh. I still think you could be clearer about how easily people twist your words." Jordan nodded. "That's fair. But I also think," she added, "you speak to a wound most of us don't know how to name. And even if I don't agree with everything, I can't ignore that." He looked at her, not triumphantly, not even gratefully, just human. "I never asked anyone to agree with me," he said, "only to listen long enough to decide why they don't." She extended her hand. He shook it, not as a gesture of alliance, but of something like respect. As she turned to leave, Nina realized this story wasn't about Jordan Peterson. It was about her, about what happens when you walk into a room prepared to fight and walk out instead prepared to think. Sometimes the most powerful answers don't silence the room. They make it quiet enough to hear what's been missing all along. Si esta historia ya te tocó el corazón, suscríbete al canal y cuéntanos en los comentarios. ¿Qué crees que está pasando realmente? Ahora, continuemos.